Hello, all. While I'm sad that we were unable to have this conference in person, I'm glad that we have transitioned to doing it virtually so I can still provide you what I deem as very valuable information. Today I just want to talk about how to optimize nutrition to avoid REDS, relative energy deficit in sport, and kind of opening up what that definition is on energy balance and what to look for in your assessment and areas of practice. The objectives for today are to understand the characteristics of athletes that put them at risk for disordered eating and eating disorders, be able to define what REDS is, what are some of the nutrition and physical risks of being in an energy deficit, explore common mistakes that athletes make with nutrition practices, and identify when the athlete has crossed the line between exploring performance and maybe potentially looking at an eating disorder. So, what I wanted to do was kind of get your brain thinking outside of the box and starting to explore some of the scenarios you might see in your practice. And so, I'm going to give you two case studies. The first one is Susie. Susie is a high school cross country runner. She's entering her sophomore year of high school, and she started having fatigue and a sharp pain down her shin when a new coach took over, increasing their mileage up to 35 miles a week. To increase her energy levels, she started increasing her vegetable intake. She decided to cut out red meat because she heard that that wasn't good for your body and limited her sweets. Mom took her to the pediatrician at the end of freshman year since her periods had become sporadic, and at that point she was put on birth control. Mom struggles to believe that anything is wrong as Susie eats all the time and she's running her best. Mom also notes that that definitely can't be that she isn't eating enough, as she has actually gained a few pounds. The sports med physician finds that Susie has a stress reaction, her ferritin is 7, and her vitamin D is 12. Mom would like to meet with a sports dietitian as she thinks she just isn't eating enough of the right stuff. Now let's talk about another case study, Dan. Dan wrestled in high school in the 145-pound weight class. Now he's a freshman in college, and his coach would like him to wrestle down at 135 pounds. Just to get a feel for his genetics and sibling history, Dan is 5'9". However, dad is 6'4". Younger brother is 15 years old and is 6'2", and brother is 12 years old at 5'8". Dan decides to begin extra workouts outside of practice and conditioning. During this time, he's trying to heal from a tendon tear that's in his Achilles. During the day, he wears multiple layers and tries to keep his intake to less than 500 calories per meal. However, he is recently finding himself waking up with intense hunger pangs and strong cravings for cereals and crackers. He finds himself having thoughts of quitting wrestling and possibly leaving the school. So one of the first things that's really critical when you have that athlete or client patient come in is to make sure that you are screening out for any potential eating disorder. At that point, if your area of interest is not, specialty is not eating disorders, you should refer on to a specialist. And sometimes this can help by doing sending to a therapist or psychologist that's trained in eating disorders, having them do things like the E26 questionnaire that starts to probe and be able to identify if there's more disordered function. Unfortunately, I've had many clients that have showed up wanting to talk about performance, wanting to talk about optimizing their nutrition when they have had an undiagnosed eating disorder for years and feel like we have served as an injustice to them. And part of it starts with looking at these characteristics of the athlete and what may put them at risk. Now, this comes from Ron Thompson and Roberta Sherman, and it mentions anorexia, but we can see these characteristics in any type of eating disorder. So the good athlete's mentally tough, it's very committed to their training. They have that pursuit of excellence. They're very coachable. They'll do whatever's asked of them. They're unselfish. They'll perform despite pain. So sometimes they can justify the way the means as they're doing it for their sport, but we need to be cautious that it's not possibly some of these characteristics that the eating disorder is thriving in. So when we look at the characteristics that we see in an individual with eating disorder, very focused on asceticism, may be defined as having excessive exercise, so above and beyond what would be defined as normal. And I always look at the quality, not the quantity, especially when we're looking at an athlete. Perfectionism, nothing feels good enough. Overcompliance, selflessness, and denial of any discomfort. So, of course, when they start to feel like, then we look at the intersection of our culture today. So, we've got this athlete that's highly driven, doing anything to please teammates, coach, um, feels like there's something that is controllable for them. And then we see these types of messages: be smart, eat smart, never, ever, ever give up. Your body is temple. Keep it pure and clean for the soul to reside in. Do not reward yourself with food. You're not a dog. I think my hitting power is stronger when I'm lighter and faster. So even now we're getting into other sports that seem to think lighter and faster. Get big or die trying. So now we are starting to see more dysmorphia with our male athletes because it's not only the focus on thin, but now even this muscle mass quota. And then looking at you are what you eat. And so for that athlete, they're not able to separate one, is there even any science to this? Our number one social media followers are usually athletes, and the things that people follow the most are what they eat in their workouts. And where 10 years ago, it would have been experts in the field, we now can have anybody get on and start describing what they're eating, and young, susceptible athletes are going to be prone to following that. And athletes are very number driven. Give them something just as that perfectionism that they can grasp onto. So it's a natural transition to look at the weight number and then to focus on calorie intake. And clean eating has become very popular with really no definition to it. And hence why we're seeing a rise in orthorexia. That athlete many times appears to be eating often and have their plate full. So going back to that Susie, where mom reports, well, gosh, it seems like she's eating all the time, so it can't be that, but is she getting enough sufficient energy? And I recommend, if you have the chance, to read the book Running in Silence by Rachel Steele, where she comments about all her focus on the raw eating movement and lots of fruits and vegetables, and her teammates would joke about her 3 plates of food, but she was actually continuing to lose weight and was really struggling with her eating disorder. And so the intersection now of the next thing that they grasp onto around numbers is perhaps if I do even more exercise, or instead of doing rest days, if I push it harder, then that's going to help me work on my fitness level, or that's going to help me impress coach. But really, what it could be, and we know with exercise, you really should consider this an exercise disorder, is that their means by which they're using that. Is it the primary means of coping? Does it occur despite injury? And matter of fact, their physical therapist and athletic trainer has told them not to do that. Is it having an impact on social interactions and relationships? Are they missing things because they're more worried about their training and exercising? Do they have withdrawal effects? You'll see a significant mood change or anxiety go through the roof when they're unable to exercise, especially during time of injury. That's why it's very tricky that we need more monitoring of athletes during that time. Overuse injury, stress fractures, menstrual irregularity, and loss of bone density. They'll actually have a decreased immunity, more frequent colds or upper respiratory tract infections, and eventually have a decrease in sport performance. Some have labeled this as overtraining syndrome. So the key is to look for these factors. And we're going to talk about this later in the presentation when you're doing an assessment. But really stepping outside some of the messages we may hear in wellness or in weight management: eat more fruits and vegetables, hydrate as much as possible, get up and get moving. Well, for our competitive athletes, it needs to be very structured and it needs to have an outcome that's tied to it. Because otherwise, what ends up happening is they go to Google it themselves. And when we start looking at the accuracy of information, we know that there is not a whole lot that's going to give them accurate information when they're trying to look for, I'm a 15-year-old female cross country runner, how much calories do I need? And we go to databases like MyFitnessPal, we know that there's a lot of error rate, as most of these apps are geared towards weight loss themselves. And so this brings us to, what are the calorie needs for athletes? So breaking that whole calories in equals calories out. We've got the calories consumed, but we're also looking at the calories expended. And then we've got other factors to consider. So the recommended energy requirements, this just gives you an example of what would be the energy expenditure according to event or sport. But we look at some of these adolescents, you've got 1,800 for baseline from age 4 to 6, 7 to 10 years of age, up to 2,000 calories. Then we get into 15 and 18-year-olds. Their baseline energy needs is 3,000. So if you add on, and in some of the local high school programs, some of these male runners may still be doing 60 miles a week. They're probably going to be looking at 5,000 calorie intake for them to maintain their energy balance. Then we're seeing this new trend of what we call later life, masters athletes, whatever you want to call it, that are engaging in more endurance-based sports. So marathons, triathletes, ultra runs. And I just want to put this in perspective for a resting or non-training movement. So let's say they're going for a walk or they're busy at work. They need 12 to 14 calories per pound. If they are doing greater than 1 hour of moderate training, they need 15 to 17 calories per pound. If they are doing greater than 1 to 2 hours of moderate intensity training, which even in the start foundation of training for a triathlon, it would be very easy for that to happen in a day. They need 24 calories per pound. When we get greater than 2 hours of training, which they probably do have 2 to 3 days of the week that would be that high, especially if they're doing a brick workout, they need 24 to 29 calories per pound. So to put this in perspective, the range of energy needs for that athlete, if we had a 150-pound female triathlete, her energy needs throughout her training cycle can vary from baseline at 1,800 calories to upwards of 4,350. And I think that shocks a lot of athletes when you demonstrate to them how significantly underfueled they are and where they're getting their messaging in regards to their nutrition. And this gives you some other perspectives. If we had, so for a football lineman, maybe in the midst of training camp, they may need 5,000 calories a day. I can tell you it's not very fun trying to make meal plans up. When we start looking at 5,000 to 7,000 calories, you get very creative. For that female cross-country runner, about 2,500 calories a day. And I will tell you, in my practice, the majority of time when I get an adolescent female cross-country runner, they have generally averaged about 1,800 to 2,000 calories a day. Most of the time, I do not see them coming in with sufficient energy intake. Male high school soccer player could be over 3,200 calories a day, and an adolescent ballerina 2,000 calories a day. So why is it so much more than calories in equals calories out? Well, first of all, we have to look at the resting metabolic rate and the things that can impact that. So we know body size, larger individuals will have more muscle mass, which is a greater resting metabolic rate. And in our athletic population, they tend to have higher percentages of muscle mass. The age, So resting metabolic rate will tend to peak in early adulthood and declines 2 to 3% per decade and thereafter. So taking into account their growth patterns, I highly recommend if you work with any athlete 20 years of age or below to also get growth curves to make sure that they have had sufficient energy balance throughout their athletic career and that they have been able to grow as they should on the growth curve. I can always remember a case study or a athlete that I had that had came in to see me, had kind of a couple months of sporadic periods. They weren't sure if the reason that she hadn't fully started her period was because just her body wasn't ready or if it was due to her running. She was a very competitive middle school runner that was projected to break the school record her freshman year. After 3 to 4 months of increasing her energy availability, which surprisingly was not that significant, it ended up being small increments that increased about 350 to 500 calories. She did start her period and had it consistently. Had followed up with her throughout that time, and then we did not see each other for 3.5 months. And we're doing a check-in appointment before she got into the bulk of her season. And at that point, when I saw her, I was astounded because she had actually grew almost 3 inches during that time. So it showed that not only did that energy balance give her body the fuel that she needed to have a menstrual cycle, but also she did catch up growth with that as well. So I can't stress that enough. It's very important to assess with our adolescent athlete that they have had consistent growth patterns. The thermic effect of foods, looking at the cost of digestion, absorption, it's about 10% of our total energy. With protein foods being the highest or the most energy to digest and absorb, so looking that they don't have too much protein intake. Again, common messaging that within our athletic population, if a little bit's good, more is better. And so sometimes we see some excessive protein intake, especially if they're using protein powders and supplements. And then looking at the energy expended during physical activity and recovery. So I stress the recovery part. This is the part that's most variable and can be 15 to 30% of the total daily energy intake. Another thing that I've come to learn during my years of practice is to not only get a 24-hour dietary recall, but also get a 24-hour activity recall. Sometimes they're going to dismiss things like band, PE, walking their dog, or if they're on a campus, how much they have to walk to class. And I had somebody that I was struggling to get her body in energy balance and get her menstrual cycle resumed. And then finally the mom said, you may want to ask a little bit more details about how active she is within the day. And so what I had been putting down is about an hour and a half to 2 hours of training. There were some days that she was doing 4.5 hours of activity. So that was a big game changer in my nutritional recommendations. And then we had to put some boundaries around activities outside of her sport. So now let's get to that term energy availability. So it's very important because the body is fascinating and it does not understand the difference between the stressor of outrunning a bear and the stressor of going and doing a hard tempo run or running up and down the field at a soccer game with higher bouts of intensity. It will prioritize giving the energy to that, and then if anything's left, it will focus on digestion. It'll focus on replenishing and strengthening the heart. So that's where we came up with the term energy availability. So that's energy balance, that is energy intake minus your total daily energy expenditure. EE is the energy expended on the metabolic rate, plus the thermic effect of food, plus our energy expenditure, and then adaptive thermogenesis. So the energy availability is the calories that are then available to the body to optimize physiological and metabolic functions. So what's left? What is the money left in the bank that the body can grow? Cellular maintenance, including immune system, thermoregulation. And Wade and Jones contended that the body's physiological and metabolic processes will be prioritized according to survival. Locks et al. Found that 45 calories per fat-free mass a day was necessary to maintain optimal energy availability. When we get below 30, we start to see disruptions. And contrary to what our society will tell us, weight is not an indicator of REDS. I have actually found probably 50% or more of my clients that have come to see me have been frustration because they've actually started to see weight gain, feeling very fatigued, starting to not perform well. So, again, what do? They start to change what they're eating, they start to reduce what they're eating, thinking that maybe if they shift their weight, that will help them perform better, when it's usually that the metabolism is starting to slow and the body is throwing up red flags. And the way this works is for the body to regulate its energy needs, it'll start to pull from liver and glycogen store. And towards the end of this presentation, we'll talk about this in terms of performance, how that will hinder, and how you usually will see the response. Then it'll pull from body fat. When they're training or active, the body will try to utilize muscle for energy. Then it reaches a critical point where the body ceases to use body fat as a fuel store. Again, it's preserving and conserving. Its first job is to protect the body. Then it starts to rely on muscle mass for energy. So you may have somebody that tends to be more fidgety. They may start to engage in even more activity. And it's very confusing to those around them because they seem like, well, gosh, if they were tired and underfueled, they wouldn't be getting up and moving around as much. Body composition will start to shift. So we actually see lean body mass go down, and the body fat will remain the same or will actually go up in percentage to the composition of the body. And again, this is more in a preserving, protective mechanism. But if they were to go and have their body composition tested, their natural instinct would be, oh, well, my body fat is staying the same or going up. Maybe I should focus on strength training and try to lose weight. But instead, they actually further contribute to that energy balance disruption. So now let's explore what happens in our body, in our brain, when there's no fuel available and you're approaching empty. So we know it's all about balance, and sometimes to keep things simple and I kind of coined the term not too sciencey. I talk about things in terms of money. So if we don't have enough money to pay the energy bills, it's got to come from somewhere, and either something is going to be reduced in the budget or something's going to get shut off. And this is where we start to see dysfunction and dysregulation. And there are two types of REDS, actually. There is chronic, where we will start to see things like the hypothalamus and pituitary axis dysregulate, and we'll see changes in thyroid, we'll see amenorrhea, lower testosterone. But we also know that there's acute changes. And this is probably one of the more proactive ways that we can assess and look at REDS, because we start to see training adaptations change. So if we're working in conjunction with the sports performance team and we have a strength coach or we have a coach that we can talk to and we know that they have a training periodization, are they hitting that? Or are they having physical markers that possibly they're not able to adapt, which could be a result? And it's not like there's a significant decline. There is research that has shown that even a 250 to 300 calorie disruption in a day can lead to signs of REDS. So we know that over time this gap can become insufficient and will not support activities of daily living. Growth will actually slow down. There may be markers of health implications and basic functioning. The syndrome can affect any organ system within our body: bone health, menstrual function, metabolic rate, our immune system, protein synthesis, cardiovascular health, and psychological health. The most common initial symptom is a change in overall mood, which can be rather difficult, especially if they're a very busy student, they're a hormonal teen, but you'll start to see them be more flat affected. And in some of the countries that tend to do more markers of psychological health with their physical health, they have found that those do tend to align. While it's more common in females, REDs also affect young male athletes. And part of that may be that it really hasn't been too long ago that we transitioned in 2014 from from the female athlete triad to REDs. And for those that may not know what the female athlete triad is or need a refresher, it was usually a significant weight change, more than 2 stress fractures, and amenorrhea, which is the loss of period for 3 months. As they expand, though, you can see lots of areas that energy imbalance can impact and affect. And the biggest thing is that it didn't include our males. So the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, decided to expand into what is known as REDs. And so now there's markers and indicators for endocrine health, metabolic, hematological, growth development, psychological, cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, and immunological. And so we'll start with one of the biggest ones that's probably received the most research. It is one of the easiest to screen for female athletes, which is our menstrual cycle. It's believed to be the first body system to dysregulate or shut off. The body views it as not necessary at that time. And if there's been a significant change, it's easy to assess in a questionnaire as well, but we'd like to see it expanded a little bit further to start looking at changes in the length of cycle, changes in it's now understood that testosterone can be the equivalent of menstrual dysfunction, so getting testosterone levels for the males as well. Many physicians, excuse me, I shouldn't say many physicians, some physicians still prescribe birth control as a way of means that they're having a menstrual cycle. But 2 things. We know that actually it does not increase bone resorption. So we are still continuing to see compromised bone density. It also induces an artificial bleed, so they're going to be more prone to anemia that also is demanding more energy out of their body as well. And there's going to be a further reduction in bone density when calorie deficit is large enough that weight loss continues. So it becomes like this false positive blanket that they're like, well, I'm having my period, so I must be okay. We're seeing now studies that have shown direct association. So let me look at some of the common nutritional medical issues that are resulting from metabolic insufficiency. So we know that a low metabolic rate, hypometabolism, so kind of slow like a turtle, that's why I put this cute guy here. They go in, it's a result of too few calories are consumed. Body starts to slow down. We actually see decreased energy use, and this allows the body to survive longer. But as a result, then the body turns the thermostat down. It kind of views this as hibernation. We don't need to do as much digestion, and that's when this fatigue settles. There also is this phenomenon called sick euthyroid syndrome. So they say, well, I'm not using the bathroom as regularly. I'm really tired. Could it be my thyroid? And the problem is if you catch them in a window, they could actually look like they have hypothyroidism. They're prescribed thyroid medication, but what's happened is the body is trying to downregulate the production of thyroid hormone. We also are seeing more saturation on the receptors. And then if they're prescribed thyroid, now we falsely have elevated their caloric output because we've increased with synthetic thyroid. And so really screening out for these other factors before they're put on any thyroid medication. The other part is we see an elevated cortisol, and this is the body's way of kind of staying in fight, flight, or freeze. This is more harmful to the bone, the heart, almost all of our organ systems. And then there's increased secretion of stomach acid. So we start looking at the heart health. I've often joked if I could have $1 for every time I had somebody try to dismiss concern um, because they believe, oh, they just have an athletic heart. Well, sometimes that can be true. And there's been controversy over if we define and assess further at 60 or below or 50 or below. But with advancements in medicine, I use the Dr. Gaudiani. So I highly recommend the book Sick Enough, what she calls is the walking test. So if it is a good, strong heart, they should be able to walk up and down the hallway with minimal changes to their um, heart rate. Excuse me. If it is a compromised heart, they may have a jump of 10 beats or more. And so that's one that would warrant going and getting possibly an EKG and looking at if we need to do limitations to their training and being more aggressive nutritionally. They tend to fight you on this, believing that they've been told they just have a low heart rate because they're in good shape. So I reflect back to the Scandinavian study where they, 2014, found comparing average elite endurance athletes and were cyclists compared to sedentary individuals that they actually, on average, only had a 10 beat difference in their resting heart rates. Where the athletes tend to differ is that they can actually have quite a bit of variability during their training. So they may have a resting heart rate of 52, but they could get up to 180 in their training, and that's not of concern because they're able to get back down to baseline afterwards. For somebody that has, again, a weakened, compromised heart, they actually start to lack in variability during their training, and hence why they're not able to make the adaptations that they should in their training. They tend to report a lot of fatigue, and using rate of perceived exertion, RPE, can be really helpful to sort that out. We know that there's a direct correlation now between amenorrhea and endothelial dysfunction. Endothelial dysfunction is the rigidity and basically inability of expansion within our arteries. Dr. Schufelt over at CEDRD has done some really cool research looking at this. And so we have macro vessels that go to the heart, and we also have micro vessels. And so those would not usually be picked up on normal testing unless they had more like a ultrasound. And when estrogen and testosterone low, these microvessels become more rigid and are more prone to forming plaque, and this can create more sentinel cardiac issues. Another thing that brings complexity is that low energy availability athletes also have unfavorable lipid panels. There's an increase in total cholesterol, and they also have an increase in low density lipoprotein. So if they were to go into a primary care office, they would find that they would probably be recommended that they need to increase their fiber intake, they need to cut their fat intake, and get to exercising more. So you can see how all three of those would be harmful messages to receive when we're already dealing with not enough sufficient energy. And here's another one that's quite unique in that I have some athletes that are significantly underfueled, and they will report all the time that, well, I'm never sick, where others tend to be prone to illness quite often. And we know that inadequate energy intake suppresses immune function. We see lymphocyte counts impacted. Our blood cells are unable to reproduce at a significant enough rate, and they may become more chronically ill. And you'll see things such as mono or an increased time of illness if they have things like the flu or even the common cold. Upper respiratory infections are more frequent in endurance athletes, not only because of the energy demands, but also because of the respiratory inflammation that can occur during heavier training. So they have that double whammy that's against them in their immune system. Many have speculated it's the training that's responsible, but new research is starting to dispute that inadequate energy and maybe nutritional inadequacies increase this immune system response. Even modest weight loss during the season can impair cell-mediated immune function, and low-carb fueling specifically can increase cortisol post-exercise, which reduces our type 1 immune defense and increases circulating lymphocyte numbers. Now we start looking at labs. I always take caution in these because, again, the body does a great job of resetting itself. And so we don't want to rest all, again, athletes are data driven. So if you're telling them to go get their labs checked and the labs come back that they're normal, reassure them that this is the body's way of compensating. And this does not mean that they necessarily are adequately nourished. The more demand on the body, the more that's needed. The other thing, too, is that there are certain nutrients that have their own kind of athletic ranges, such as ferritin, vitamin D, and we want to make sure that even if they're being told that they have a normal lab level, that we're addressing for that athletic population. The less replenished in the diet, obviously the less is stored for use, and so we're going to see more groups prone to that, such as those that are limiting their meat, remember Susie, or vegetarian diets. So we're looking at those B complex vitamins, iron, calcium, zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D. So again, we've just listed several nutrients that are important for energy levels, several nutrients that are very important for bone health. Performance-wise, this can lead to fatigue, muscle weakness, cramping, musculoskeletal injuries, and increased risk of infections. So we know that GI motility is slowed for several different reasons. One, as that body is becoming more efficient. It wants to slow down the rate of digestion and absorb as much nutrition out of as possible. The other part is that it's a muscle in itself, so it can be weakened from lack of nutrition, and the fact that digestive enzymes work in supply and demand, and they may actually not be able to keep up with the rate of digestion. This can lead to increased bloating and early satiety. So when they're told messages like only eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, then they may be stopping too soon within their meals because they're having increased bloating and early satiety. This has to be addressed as one of the top risk factors that kind of starts into the development of REDS. There's an 85% correlation between functional gut disorders and eating disorders. And in my practice, I have seen this be kind of the first thing that people start to change. Well, I'm having trouble with dairy. I'm going to cut dairy out. Well, was it that their body is unable to process dairy at this time, or is it the fact that the body was stressed, therefore they weren't able to absorb it efficiently? The intestinal mucosa can thin and smooth, which also then causes a decrease in digestive enzymes. 90% of our serotonin receptors are in the gut and could be managed with stress reduction. And so maybe tying some of that in as well when we look at ways to recover and our nutritional recommendations as well. I firmly believe this is why we've seen more an increase of quote unquote what they call leaky gut in the athletic population. Is the more that we get into the endurance sports, the more stress that's been under the body, and they have more GI related issues, but it usually comes at around the same time that they are not getting enough sufficient energy. I have a athlete that I work with that has done the Kona, which is a very significant competitive Ironman, which is also done in very extreme temperatures. And we got to where we could identify in his patterns when his morning heart rate would start to trend down, he would not get enough sufficient sleep. So during that training, that was looking at more like almost 9 to 10 hours for the amount of work that he was doing. Then as a result, he wasn't eating enough food, specifically carbohydrates, because he was too tired and weak to want to fix his own meals. So it's kind of like the whack-a-mole that starts to trend, and you got the domino effect, but what do we need to address first? Do we need to make sure that there's always sufficient sleep? If not, then we back off the training. Do we then know if that occurs that there may going to be more intolerances and inabilities to consume some of these foods? And then lastly, are there ways that we can streamline and make meals easier for them so they're not having to put a whole lot of energy into use? So I just wanted to throw this in there, obviously, kind of stay within my scope of practice, but I loved how they flipped also and focused on the potential performance effects of reds. This is where I've been able to get the athletes to buy in, because if you start talking to a 15-year-old about their bone health and why periods are important, you may not be able to get them to fully buy in. But if we start talking about, like, hey, did you know that when you don't get enough fuel or if you don't eat your snack before practice, that your coordination may be lower, which means that your reaction time is going to be slower and you won't be able to get to rebounds quick enough. Or that you may have an increased risk of injury because your coordination is impaired. And so instead of jabbing off that foot with strength and explosion, you may feel a little bit more wobbly, which again puts your knee at risk for potential injury. So tying it into their sport and tying into some of the performance effects that may occur is really important. And this goes back to where we talked about when the body pulls from energy. So decreased glycogen. So rather than the body being able to replenish and build up the glycogen stores to be able to do the endurance, to be able to do the level of intensity, it's not able to do that. And then we see muscle strength start to diminish because now the body has had to use muscle as fuel rather than being able to build up and strengthen, which then we start to see decreased endurance performance because that mitochondria has not been formed or increased in that muscle fiber. And so really tying that in, and then maybe even having them circle what they feel like they have been impacted by the most. And then I lastly go back to the depression. We're seeing increased focus, increased attention from the athletes themselves in the depression and mood. And I think it's really important for them to understand that our food creates these neurotransmitters, that the neurotransmitters in our brain make our mood. So if we don't have enough sufficient fuel, then we don't have enough neurotransmitters produced that make our mood. And so we feel very flat. We feel very flat affected. And I think that helps kind of normalize and be able to open up that discussion for them. So specifically as a dietitian, I want to kind of talk about some of the nutritional considerations that we should be assessing for and taking a look at. One is looking at when fiber gets above 50 grams a day, or it could be even less than that, looking at that individual's responsiveness, we see a disruption in the estrogen receptors in the digestive tract. And they also keep that kind of premature early satiety. And this is pretty easy to do. Once they've learned things like sprinkling your chia seeds, doing your Quest bars, going more plant-based, which all are good. I'm not really pound on the Quest bars though. Then they could be more susceptible to this. And again, I really love the book Running in Silence where she talks about that in her raw diet. Protein above their needs. Again, that thermogenic effect. They're feeling full all the time. That usually means they're not getting enough sufficient carbohydrates. That also means they may be limiting fat. So these are things to look for. And then being able to spend that time and kind of debunking that information for them that, okay, you only really need this much protein and you have to break up your protein throughout the day. So therefore, adding double scoops of your whey protein is not going to do you any good. Assessing if they are in active growth and being able to provide education that they will need energy for that on top of their sport. And so we think about this in the high school setting, but when I worked with college athletes, still telling like a 20-year-old adolescent male, like, you're still growing and you're doing all this training, we really are going to have to significantly increase your meal plan so that you have enough fuel. Look at the social influence. So not only social influence on media, so I think it's important to ask like who are their favorite followers, but also take a look at their social influence on their teams. Teams can have their own culture and how they approach food. It could start from a coach, it could start from a player, it could start from athletes that are popular in their sport, and being able to ask how they perceive that pertains to them. Do they feel like that actually works for you? That's something I ask my athletes quite often, like, okay, when you started making changes, Did you start performing better? And it's kind of ironic how many of them say no. So having them take a look at goals. Then we look at tying in the good old fit philosophy. I start to look at, okay, did your frequency of training increase? Are you overlapping where maybe your competitive soccer is wrapping up for 2 or 3 weeks and you've got high school volleyball, especially in the Midwest, with the changes in sports, they could be playing one competitive season all year round, but also be doing high school sports. And so I've had some that are doing like 5 hours of activity a day. It's insane. Did their intensity change? So a common area that I would see athletes make mistakes on is flipping from cross country to track. Well, they're doing less mileage, but they downplay the fact that their intensity is going to go up as a result of that. And so they may not eat as much, or they step back their fueling accordingly. Are they switching the type? So remember, when our body is not as sufficient, it actually is going to need more energy, and so that can increase their nutritional needs. And then time. So are they doing more? Are they increasing their baseline of running? And sometimes I use some basic strategies there. Lastly, and I probably should have put this last on the list of slides, is just look at the small things. Is it the end of season and finals week is coming up and their schedules are really busy, so oops, they forgot that they need to be doing their snack. Or mom and dad have been rushed, and so they got this different bar, and it's 200 calorie deficit. Like looking for some of those lateral changes that maybe is enough to change in their total energy intake, and really preaching the importance of consistency, like that athlete I shared with you earlier. And how can we make it easier for them so that they can optimize their nutrition all season long? Because ultimately, we don't want them run out, or they might run into the wall. And we know there's varying stages of when somebody is in reds. It's correctable. But if there's some markers of overtraining with it, it could be a few months to sometimes a full year, especially when we get into the very elite competitive athletes that need to do quite extensive training. They may not be able to fully recover for a few months. So I was able to help Ashley Koff make this Better Nutrition Athlete Assessment. You can go to her website and purchase some of the tools, but it incorporates all the questions that we talked about today. Has your digestion changed? What's been the color of your urine? How are you calculating how much carbs and proteins to have? Are you an endurance athlete? Are you a strength athlete? And so you can use this in your practice to be able to pick up maybe when that timeline started that they had a disruption in their energy, what are some changes that they may have made, and then even looking at injury risk. So now, in conclusion, taking a look at our case studies. So I always take a look at when they've had a jump in training. Again, freshman year, sophomore year, they're going to also be training more often. When she increased her vegetable intake and cut out what foods were diminished. When she limits her sweets, is she still able to go and eventually or occasionally have ice cream with her teammates? Has it developed into rigidity that we probably need to be screening for an eating disorder? Can I approach mom and talk to her and give her some good information? Dr. Nicole Rinaldi with No Period Now What has a great handout that you can actually give to the physicians, discouraging the use of birth control as a means of inducing a period. And then explaining to mom, I understand that she is eating all the time, but is it energy dense foods? Is she becoming full quicker than normal? And though she may be competing at her best, which again, the brain focuses on that as the stressor, if she hits a wall, these are the risk factors that could be happening, and explaining that stress reaction is a preliminary marker of her body saying that it can't handle that. And then reassuring her that the weight that is gained is actually a result of the fact that her metabolism is slowing right now in an attempt to protect herself, and that she shouldn't be alarmed and that we should be thankful that the body is trying to do that. And now looking at Dan, going back to that genetic history, I would be curious, how long has Dan been in wrestling? Has he had to suppress his weight this whole entire time that maybe has hindered adequate growth? They may need to look at if his growth plates are closed completely. Why is he doing these extra workouts? Could that have been what contributed to his tendon tear in his Achilles? Does his strength coach even know this, and then really try to get him to adhere to that coaching plan? Because again, remember that athlete is a people pleaser. So if they know that their coach would not be supportive of them doing additional training, then they're more likely to not do that. And then explaining his energy needs, that at 500 calories a day, this is why now he's waking up in the middle of the night. It's his brain and his body's way of saying, like, hey, I'm in starvation mode and I'm not getting enough carbs and I can't stay asleep because I'm not able to produce enough melatonin and serotonin. So can you please give me some cereal and crackers to do so? And then exploring with a psychologist or a mental health clinician, is it truly that he's wanting to quit wrestling? Or is it right now his brain just does not have enough fuel or desire to do the training? And it could be the result of not eating enough. There's a great consensus statement that came out on mental health, and I loved how they said sometimes you can sort out if it is depression or mood changes as a result of too much training, not too much training, but not enough training that's matched with energy and rest. By usually within 3 or 4 days, their mood will start to improve. If it doesn't, then we're ruling out if it's any clinical depression. Here are some helpful resources. I do have a podcast with my colleague Kara Shulman, Fit for a Queen, which stands for the female athlete trying to balance performance, health, intellect, and time for self. The Victory program at McCowan Place has an athlete-specific track. There used to be the Elite Athlete program. I think it still exists at ED Care in Denver. I already talked about Running in Silence with Rachel Steele. Anything by Ron Thompson or Roberta Sherman. They're jokingly known as the godmother and godfather of eating disorder in sport. And then if you're trying to assess that exercise, there is an obligatory exercise questionnaire and exercise dependent scale that you can use in your sessions. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you found this supportive, and I highly encourage you also to please go get my book, Finding Your Sweet Spot, How to Avoid Red S, and keep your athlete and energy balance all season long.